Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Welcome. Thanks for coming along. I've got a bit of a history with Norfolk. The government at one point got me to test food-producing soils on the island, or my company Nutritech, and we tested 40 or 50 soils, and we found, interestingly, that there were 5 minerals missing in every soil regardless. And interestingly, 2 of those minerals were boron and copper, and boron and copper are specifically linked to arthritis. And in this instance, it's quite a unique scenario here because you are what you eat, and what you eat comes from a soil, and that soil lacks these key minerals, and every soil lacks the same 5 minerals. But those 2 specifically, I then investigated arthritis levels, and they were really, really high levels compared to the mainland. So it was a prime example of this whole story of what I call nutrition farming, that we are what we eat, and what we eat comes from a soil that's a shadow of what it formerly was. And so it becomes a huge priority to change that equation and bring back those forgotten flavours, that enhanced shelf life, and most importantly, those enhanced medicinal qualities. The founder of modern medicine, Hippocrates, made the statement, "Let your food be your medicine and your medicine be your food." And we realise now, almost on a weekly basis, just how profound that statement was, in recognition of the realisation that food is and was supposed to be our medicine, and that to get your nutrition from food compared to buying it from a mineral or a vitamin from a shop, there is a zero comparison. I mean, basically food contains the cofactors that determine the uptake and utilisation of those minerals in the human body. We were supposed to get our food from fruit and minerals, and our nutrition from fruit and vegetables and meat and so forth. And the sad story of that is that over the last 50 years particularly, where there's been quite some significant research, there are 3 books and probably 80 published papers chronicling the decline in nutrition in our food. And it's quite dramatic. It's the figures like 50% less iron, 32% less calcium, 31% less magnesium. And in some cases, our primary source of cobalt, for example, and you think, oh, that's a pretty insignificant trace mineral, but it's not, and I'll explain why shortly. Our primary source of cobalt was the food that we eat most profoundly, which of course is cereal grains, bread and so forth. And then we had the Green Revolution, and we had Norman Borlaug win a Nobel Prize for something he probably should have got a kick in the ass for, because the deal was our big original wheat varieties were falling over, lodging, and 27% lost one year. And they said, okay, it's virtually a Nobel Prize guarantee for anyone who can hybridise something shorter and more squat that's less prone to falling over. And Norman cheated. He actually irradiated a bunch of wheat, took out a mutant, and that mutant became our food. And we weren't told that the downside to this thing that was more abundant and more squat and less prone to lodging was that it contained a significant lower, particularly it was actually those exact figures, it was 50% less iron, low 30s, low 20s for most of the trace minerals, and one trace mineral that can't uptake at all, and that trace mineral is cobalt. And cobalt's the building block in the human body for vitamin B12, and most of you in this room, should you decide to check, it's just ringing a little bit, we just need to come down a little bit. I don't think we can make any louder because it's just ringing at the moment. If we turn it around, turn it around a bit. Good plan. Yes, so the story with cobalt is the building block for B12, and most people, if you check, you usually got to go online and check what ideal levels of B12 are in your blood. You'll find this issue with a deficiency in B12 in most people, so most people need to supplement. But that's just a small, tiny example of this relationship between, if we take something like selenium, which is one of the largest deficiencies in Australian soils, and it's a hugely important mineral, it's the most important mineral for your most important organ, your liver. And selenium, if we were to say, okay, where can we get a natural source of it? Well, the highest source, and I'm talking ridiculously high in comparison to the next closest, is the Brazil nut. And the Brazil nut contains a whole suite of things that help with selenium uptake. The biggest of those is vitamin E. Vitamin E is the most important cofactor for selenium utilisation and uptake, and Brazil nuts are packed with vitamin A, and that's how it's supposed to be. That's what food as medicine is all about. So, continuing the story, I had a kind of life-changing event where I had a daughter horrifically injured, brain damaged and so forth in a car accident, in a coma for 3 months, and then all the machines started beeping and they said, that's brain death approaching. And so I made this kind of deal. I'm not conventionally religious, but I know there's something out there. And I made this deal that should she survive against the odds, I would do something of value with the rest of my life. And she came out of the coma 20 minutes later, and this is my something of value, 27 years of it. So I formed this company called Nutritech Solutions that involves training and developing regenerative agriculture inputs. We have a human health division, we have a pet division, an animal division, obviously a very large agriculture division, education, and we've got farms that we produce other products, and those farms are called nutrition farms, and we have a big apple farm. We produce apple cider and apple juice and apple cider vinegar and dried apples and so forth. And it's part of teaching farmers how to value add, because it's very much what's required in a very, very difficult industry, particularly in the last year, where input costs have doubled and in some cases trebled. And so it's just become harder than what was already hard. It's become more difficult. So you kind of need to have more than one string to your bow, and I'm sort of trying to demonstrate that as part of what we do. So we used to call it biological agriculture, and then there was a survey into that term, and it was discovered that most consumers, when they hear that word, think of biological warfare or guys tinkering with jeans and white coats. And so we had to come up with a different term, and that's where the term regenerative agriculture surfaced. But the thing that we do, we call nutrition farming, because it's all about this whole story of nutrition and how important that whole story is. So an integrated, holistic system where we look at the links between soil health, crop resilience, animal vitality, farmers' health. It's, in my opinion, part of that holistic story is that the healthier you are, the more likely you are to produce healthy food, and we do see that ring true. And planetary wellness, which has become a major driver for me as I've recognised this profound link between soil health and planetary health, and I'll explain that as we go. Now, we've also got a gardening division, and we call it nutrition gardening, and that's all about this production of nutrient-dense medicinal food with forgotten flavours. And in this point that I'll make tonight, that minding your own patch can actually be your biggest contribution to what is the biggest challenge that we've got ever faced, which is this global warming challenge. So what started those 27 years ago, or 28 years I think it is now, since my daughter's accident and my pledge to do something of value, was just a trickle of interest. It was a hard battle in the early years, and that's changed. And I'm just one of many people working in this field, but all of us have noted that it was like a switch was flicked perhaps 5-7 years ago, and there's just really a revolution underway. And this is just a small example. We're talking here about the largest food producers, these two companies. This is 6.5 billion, this is $6.8 billion turnover. This is Driscoll's Berries at 3.5 billion, and the largest organic growers on the planet. 1.4 billion of that turnover is organic. But what's interesting, because most people think, oh, organic, you fall in a heap, and at some point you catch up because you get higher premiums. That's old school thinking. And this company, the largest organic producers on the planet, last year the organic division out-yielded their conventional division by 11%, and consequently their game plan now within 5 years is to be 100% organic, which is quite impressive. But it demonstrates that that's organic by neglect. Informed organic agriculture, it's just a different road to Rome. There's a few things you can't do, but there's things you can do to replace it, and you need to understand how that model works. Training ag departments, meeting with ag ministers, including the UK minister for 3 hours last time I was in Europe, in the UK. Training supermarket chains. There's a whole supermarket chain called Woolworths, not the same, nothing to do with our Woolworths, privately owned, half of it. And that their whole 540 stores, I've trained them 3 times now, all of the growing is done with nutrition farming principles, and they call it farming for the future, and you will not find better food anywhere on the planet than Woolworths in South Africa. It is really, really special food. Mentoring climate change groups. This is a group founded after my first talk in LA, and they've gone on to really do some. This is just the impact that they've had. This is the Paris climate change event. This was a little animated film that I funded, speaking to some billionaires. We got $120,000 in one night, believe it or not, and we made this little animated film that tells the story of the link between soil health and planetary health from a climate change perspective. And they had friends that knew friends, and they got it up in lights on the Eiffel Tower every night of that massive climate change event, and it went viral, and they've gone on to become this major group with a Netflix movie that's won 23 awards to date that tells the story between soil health and planetary health. So let's look at how we got to where we are, and what you might think of as conventional food production and conventional agriculture, I call the chemical experiment. It's not how we always did things. And the very first thing to recognise with that model, it started with a German chemist who burnt some plant matter 10 decades back or slightly more. And when you burn 100 kilos, you get 5 kilos of ash. 5% is ash, and the ash is the minerals that grew that crop. And so Justus von Liebig burnt some plant material, analysed the ash with the crude technology that was present at that time, said, look, it's 99% nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. We can make this stuff. We've got dormant armament factories lying everywhere. Let's start making NPK fertilisers. So a model that previously was integrated with livestock, and there's a cycling happening. Obviously, every time you take a crop, you remove a little bit of minerals, but you have some recycling happening with the livestock and so forth. And the farming practices and the green manure crops and things that were just part and parcel of farming. And we said, oh, we can put it all on from a bag. And so what we did was dumb down nutrition. Now, it's very simple. The first cell that oozed from the Precambrian ocean had 74 minerals, and there were no accidents in a perfect blueprint called nature. There's 74 minerals there, there's a purpose for each and every one of them, and every time you take a crop off, you remove a little bit of all of those, and you at least cycling that model, and now you stop doing that and just took off 74 things and put 3 things back. That dumbed down nutrition within a period of 10 to 12 years. If you look back historically at what happened, we started to see pest and disease pressure unlike anything we'd seen previously. And rather than say, is there a link to this dumbed down nutrition, which of course there was, science stepped up the plate and we started developing rescue chemicals. Now, just so you understand how that model has evolved, more chemicals every year. So last year, 14.7%, the year before, 14.4% increase. We're talking thousands of tonnes when we talk 14.4%. 14.1 the year before that, 13.9, 13.6, 13.2. Every single year for 10 decades, we've put more and more into the equation. But wait for it, every year for 10 decades, there's been more pest and disease pressure. It's literally hiding to nothing. You're putting more and more on for less and less response. And is there a price to pay for that? Well, let's get down to the grim part of the story. Every culture prior to ours at some point has asked the question, what does the next generation inherit? And if we ask that question relative to our food production, there's not a lot of studies saying, well, okay, we did this. Oh, here's the story. So we did the research and we said a guinea pig can handle 4 parts per million of diethane or 5 parts per million of glyphosate in a 3-month trial. So that's called a minimum residue level. But there were 2 things that we weren't told about that model, and you need to know about them. Everyone needs to know about them. The first of those is called the cocktail effect. What happens when you eat a tomato with 7 chemicals or a snow pea with 11, or there are some that go as many as 18 chemicals that are used in their production. But say you've eaten the snow pea with 11 chemicals, what happens when those chemicals mix together, even in their tiny amounts? Has there been any work in the combination of chemicals? See, if you understand chemistry, you'll understand you put 3 chemicals together, very commonly, if not always, you'll get a 4th or a 5th. No one has ever researched the cocktail effect until I was training the Dole Corporation's a billionaire who owns 51% of the company, and one of his mates is a billionaire who's lost 3 wives to cancer, and he decided that he would research the cocktail effect. And basically, he looked at 10 chemicals, and of course there are many, many more than 10 chemicals out there, and 100 of their potential combinations. Now, what you need to know, if you put 10 people around a table, how many seating positions are there? Well, there's over 1 million. It's 1.17 million. You think, how's that possible? Well, it is. When you take 1 to 100% of 10 things, you've got hundreds of thousands. I don't know the actual figure, but there's hundreds of thousands of potential combinations. They looked at 100 in a 3-year study and found 3 new class 3 carcinogens, which means they proved that that new combination gave cancer to animals, a little less ethical in a 3-year period to prove the same thing for humans, but we can assume there's a problem. Well, we weren't told about the cocktail effect. And the second thing we weren't told about was something called bioaccumulation. How does your body manage that really quite an ocean of tiny amounts of chemicals that are coming in on most food we're eating? Well, your most important organ, as I touched upon earlier, a minute ago, is not actually your heart. Your most important organ is your liver, and your liver is charged with hugely important things like digestion, making digestive enzymes along with the pancreas, but probably more importantly is your 2-stage detoxification system. I mean, more importantly, in a world with 74,000 registered chemicals, that we can detox as much as possible. And the liver is charged with this two-stage system to remove those chemicals. Now, is that successfully happening? What it does is that many of the chemicals, at least 50% of them, are actually copied off nature, and so there is actually a pathway. Like you get a snake bite mercury or arsenic, there's a pathway with which the liver initiates to begin sort of minimising the damage associated with the chemical the best it can do. But the liver's not seen over half of our chemicals. They're our inventions. And the liver says, what the hell is that bloody thing? Because it can pick the structure is not right. And so it pumps them off and it stores them in our fat cells, and there they accumulate. Now that phenomenon is called bioaccumulation. So when we finally get back to the question of the next generation, and we look at the first study that I'm even familiar with, which was 7 years back, 1,400 school children, the 13 most commonly used farm chemicals, fungicides, pesticides, herbicides, nematicides, a wormicide that almost every cattle producer uses. And they looked at the presence in those 1,400 kids, 700 from town, 700 from rural areas, and the presence of those 13 chemicals. And to the horror of the researchers, couldn't find a single child who didn't have over the acceptable FDA limits of all 13 farm chemicals. That's called bioaccumulation. Part of what they were doing was tissue testing and picking up that accumulation in the fat. So our inheritance to our children, and there is no debates about this, our largest killer of children is childhood leukemia. There's a leukemia ward in every city. It's a new disease first discovered in 1908 and directly linked to environmental chemicals. There is no debates, there is no arguments. That's what causes the largest killer of our kids. So if we can do it better, it's exciting to me that the world seems to be changing and recognising that need for change. So we'll continue. Drivers of this wake-up call, this revolution, thankfully, that's underway. We mentioned the increasing amounts, 1.1 million tonnes last year. We mentioned the study of the 13 most commonly used chemicals, unacceptable in every child, according to FDA standards that accumulated. That's called bioaccumulation, that we weren't told about. Other drivers, the most important substance, the most valuable substance on the planet is not lithium or gold or platinum or diamonds or whatever, it's called topsoil. There is absolutely nothing more important than that thin veil of topsoil that feeds us. It's precious, it's fragile, and we're losing between 7 and 12 tonnes a hectare per year. And at that rate, according to Professor Rattanlow, we've got 54 years and there's zero. Well, we hit the wall way before 54 years. Understand that 10 billion people, with half the topsoil, we can't feed people. You say, oh, we can eat hydroponics. No, you can't, and it's actually crap food anyway. So we need a soil restoration initiative. As I was talking with the minister in the UK yesterday, it's so important. And the problem with this erosion and this loss of topsoil is that it's just speeding up ridiculously. I mean, we just did a tour down the southern states, and every river's running brown. I mean, that's you're not supposed to really run brown. That's erosion taking topsoil and washing it out into the ocean. So, and then we see dust storms. And so you say, well, why are we losing so much topsoil? And why do we have a dust storm that coated the entire eastern coast of Australia about a decade or so back, from South Australia right up to Cairns? That's a loss of the glue that holds those soils together. And the figures are that we've gone from 5% organic matter in 1900 to 1.5% organic matter. And organic matter or humus is the glue that holds the soil together. In the absence of it, there's nothing holding that soil, or there's much less holding it, and so we're losing it at that tremendous rate, and we can't do that. It's so important that we change that story. 2/3 of that humus. And so the first thing to understand about carbon and this blanket, most people say, oh yeah, there's this greenhouse blanket and the sun passes through and it warms the earth and it moves back and some of it's trapped. And they talk about the greenhouse blanket as if it's some kind of poisonous substance up there, but you need to understand that those gases, carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide predominantly, without that blanket, we're not here. That's what creates a livable climate. It's really, really important that we have a greenhouse blanket. It's just that we've made that blanket a little thicker than previously, and most of that, well, a lot of that, not all of it, but most of it is about carbon. And when we say, okay, where did it come from? Yeah, well, we've got coal-fired power stations, and we've got industry, and we've got 7.4 or 7.5 billion lungs breathing out CO2 and many more animals doing the same thing and so forth. And we've got interesting things. The second largest source of CO2, surprisingly for most people, is concrete making. Who would have thought? You take calcium carbonate, you can hear the word carbon in there, you burn it, and the carbon component goes up into the atmosphere, and we've got things like the Silk Road Initiative and massive amounts of concrete happening across the globe, as they have been for years. But it's the second largest cause. Just have a mouthful of water. But the first thing to understand in relation to understanding carbon is that there's only the same number of carbon molecules that have ever been here since the start of time, however you think that was. But the start of time, same carbon molecules, and they cycle. It's what makes us all as one. It's what dust to dust in the Bible is about, is that we all become some other carbon-based life form at some point. It's the same molecules. You can't make new carbon. So that carbon is called the carbon cycle. The lion's share by far is stored in the soil, mostly as organic carbon or humus, some of it in inorganic forms like calcium carbonate and so forth. And then there's the carbon-based life forms, plants, animals, trees, and then there's the blanket, the CO2, and it basically cycles between those three places. But the largest storehouse by far is humus in the soil, and 2/3 of that is now up there. And that's almost double everything else we did. The coal-fired power stations, the industry, the CO2 lungs, the concrete making, and so forth. Double came from the soil, and the fastest way to change it is to build, when you take a soil test and say, I've got 2%, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and now I've got 3% the next year, you can't say, I made some new humus, because you can't make new carbon. What you did was step into the carbon cycle and sequester what otherwise would have been up there. It's direct carbon sequestration. That's what the whole story of Kiss the Ground is about. The movie Kiss the Ground, have a reverence for the most important thing on the planet called topsoil, and of course the substance that holds it together called organic matter or humus. It's so important, it's beyond belief. And if you sit down with a calculator and say, okay, I've got my 100 square metres and I'm a home gardener and I'm going to build my organic matter, I'm going to double it this year, and then you do a calculator and say, okay, my 100 square metres, this is my contribution, and then do that, and you'll understand that that's the biggest contribution you can make. It's bigger than turning off your lights or putting on solar panels, or not that those things aren't important, but it's the biggest single contribution. It makes gardening, or nutrition gardening as I call it, just the most important practice, and that's just the start of that story, as I'll point out. So we've lost 2/3 of our humus. We've finally started looking at soil life. I've had professors come up to me after my longer courses and say, we've never mentioned microorganisms in our entire career. It's kind of an insanity when you recognise what is nutrition farming. It's about minerals, microorganisms, and humus, organic matter, and their interplay. That's what it is, basically. It's an intimate, inextricable relationship between those three things, and it's understanding with how that system works and working with that natural system rather than what we've been doing, which is working against that system. If you look at the definition of the word science in Webster's dictionary, the definition of science is adherence to natural laws and principles. You've got a perfect blueprint, and science is learning. How does that work, and how can we work with it? And what we said was, we can do better than that. Or no, you can't, mate. You're on your knees staring down the abyss. You can't do better than perfect. It's an arrogance beyond conception, and it's led us to the mess we're in. And gradually, thankfully, we are waking up. And one of those awakenings is a recognition of how important the soil life is, the life beneath our feet. There's more organisms in a handful of soil than there is people on the planet. And they do a huge lion's share of the process of producing healthy food. And we've bombed them on every level. And there's a very, very strong parallel between those organisms in the soil and the massive number of services they perform to their host, the plant. First, understand how it works. The most important process on the planet is called photosynthesis, and that's the process of taking water, CO2 and sunlight, and an almost miraculous process, and creating glucose. And glucose is the building block of everything. That's where you come from. All carbon-based life forms come from glucose, and the plant uses glucose in conjunction with minerals for everything that it does. But then, interestingly, it pumps 30%, half of what it produces it pumps down, because the roots need glucose for everything they do. So it makes glucose all day with sunlight, water and CO2, pumps that glucose down into the roots, and then 60% of what goes to the roots is pumped out from the roots to feed the soil life. And you think, why would you give away your most important substance? But there, as I touched upon this afternoon, at the nexus of the most important process on the planet, there's nothing more important. That's where we get our food from, that's where we come from. It's a hugely important process, but there at the nexus of that process is the most important principle, and that most important principle is give and you shall receive. The plant knows the deal, and there's the lesson. It feeds the soil life, And in return, the soil life gives massive amounts back. It fixes nitrogen, it solubilizes phosphorus. There's a microbe behind every mineral, produces a whole range of biochemicals that stimulate immunity. There are predatory fungi that eat disease organisms, all of whom are looked after, nurtured and farmed effectively by your crop feeding that sugar. But now that we start looking at what we've done in modern agriculture and chemical agriculture specifically, we find complete decimation. Now the most obvious part of what's called the soil food web, this massive army and this massive diversity of creatures that should exist in our soils, the most obvious example is the earthworm. And I asked the question in the many countries in which I travel, and pre-COVID it was 30 countries a year, how many of you can tell me that you've got significant numbers of earthworms left in your soil? And you'll get 1 in 50 hands go up. And it used to be that there was a flock of birds behind every time you worked the soil. And earthworms are massively important creatures. Just for one tiny little breakout talk about earthworms, earthworms decompose and create humus 4 times rapidly than any other known method. So how important if humus is the planet saver, and there's a creature that can make it 4 times faster and more efficiently than anything else, why on earth wouldn't we do everything we can do to bring back earthworms? And what we find is that we've killed a lot of their food sources, that when you start analysing soils, you find this massive decimation of soil life. And then you realise that you're just really kind of hydroponically feeding the crop, because the whole story that's unfolding, which a lot of the work comes from Professor James White, who's done some amazing work in the last 5 to 10 years. And what he's demonstrated, stuff we didn't know before, was that plants get most of their nutrition, over half of it, from actually eating. It's called rhizophagy, it's called the rhizophagy cycle. They actually eat microbes, and they strip their cell walls off and eat the minerals and nutrients and protein from the microbes. That's where they get, that's how things in the wild exist. They thought, oh yeah, there's just minerals in the soil and the plant takes them, but that's only half of the story. The other half is the biology is just beyond any importance that we ever had before. And then the plant spits out a few, allows a few to escape, often without their cell wall, and they reclaim a cell wall when they get outside the plant. And now they've got the whole internal understanding of the genetics and the requirements of that specific plant. And then that microbe, you've got all these other organisms crowd around the root waiting for their daily feed of sugar, and that those escapees share their understanding through a process called quorum sensing, where they share this messaging, and all the microbes then are geared to say, okay, we know what you need, we'll look after you, and you'll look after us even better. And that's how growing plants works, and no one knew that stuff. It's fascinating beyond conception when you start understanding how it actually works and how important this forgotten soil. And just as we're recognising, we thought of ourselves physically, this is back to the human story, we thought of ourselves physically as basically a sack of 10 trillion cells. We've got 10 trillion cells, a community of cells, all of whom can do everything but tend to specialise and do specific things, communicating thousands of times a second, and that's who we are. That allows us to walk and do whatever we do. And that was our understanding about, we've got a whole separate thing called a soul, but this was our understanding of our physical body. And then we discovered this thing called the microbiome, that we've got this 30-foot tube called a digestive tract, and inside that tube lives 100 trillion organisms. So there's 10 times more than the total number of cells of something else. There's more of them than us. Your skin has 6 billion organisms per square centimetre, and you could say, get those filthy things off there, and hop into a bath of Dettol morning and night, and 6 days later you're dead. You killed your protective biofilm. it's a synergistic creature. And when you start seeing the research that's unfolding, I was talking at one conference on soil health linked to human health, and there were 2 professors there, both of whom were microbiologists. Now, one of them was talking about her research, which is about to be published on manic depression. So she's taking long-term, we talk about the gut being the second brain, you want more evidence than this one, long-term manic depressive people with bipolar disorder, and what they did was something called a fecal transplant. Now, the idea of a fecal transplant is that you find someone who's bomb-proof, who never gets crook, and who comes from a family who never gets crook because there's a very strong familial link to that bomb-proof person, and you pay them to poo. $400 a poo. Try and get 2 poos a day, it's pretty good money. I don't know how you describe your job, but and so you pay that person, and what they've done in this particular study, and it's quite a large number involved, they nuke everything in your gut. That's what a fecal transplant is. They give you not one antibiotic, but a whole suite of them that kills, because you haven't just got Acidophilus and bifidus, you've got this whole community, diverse community living within you, and you kill the whole shooting box, and you replace it with someone else's microbiome. You actually brew the organisms, put a tube up your bottom, and put this complete, that's why it's called a fecal transplant. The figures that are about to be published, 86.2% cure rate of long-term bipolar disorder by changing the organisms. That's how important, and that's the direct same story. We've got our stomach within, the plant has an external stomach, it looks after this army of organisms who do very much the same thing as our internal stomach does for us, happens outside of the plant. The plants can't digest anything, they can't, so they have that whole system happening and they feed it, just like we feed our system, and it's a wonderful parallel system. So now that we started looking, we find this massive decimation, but the most important of those creatures that has been obliterated is a creature called mycorrhizal fungi, a little creature that burrows into the plant, creates, right from the start, creates this relationship that continues for the life of the plant unless we kill it, and it expands out and gives us a massive network of tiny filaments that can access minerals that are very immobile and hard to access, things like phosphorus and zinc, which are really hard to get. They don't float around in soil solution like other minerals. Can mine minerals and deliver minerals with this big extension, access nutrition and moisture, produce a whole series of biochemicals to look after your host because they're looking after you. It's this wonderful synergistic relationship. But then the new finding, from only discovered in 1996, was that the most common strain, called the glomeller strain, spits out the sticky carbon substance called glomalin. And what we now understand is that glomalin is a triggering mechanism for 1/3 of all the humus in the soil. It comes from one creature that's 90% gone. So why don't we bring it back? Why don't we pay people $10 a month to inoculate their soils and bring back this creature that creates stable humus? And 1/3 of the humus that used to be in the soil, that's about what's in the atmosphere causing the problem. It's literally a game changer if we change that equation. So we certainly need to be looking at these things. Now, continuing the wake-up call, to keep moving, our food's become a shadow of what it used to be. Most people know that. The biggest guideline is your taste buds will tell you the better it tastes, the better it is for you. And most people will acknowledge that tomatoes or bananas or carrots or whatever. We've got some wonderful food here on that front from where we were at Matt's today. I mean, that's got to be one hell of an achievement to grow an onion like that using nutrition farming principles. Matt's been with this model for quite some years. Beautiful carrots. And carrots normally are very, very chemical. You use nematicides to start them and you're constantly hitting them with fungicides and insecticides. So it just shows you that it's not actually necessary. Basically, degenerative illness, the interesting story with that is the World Health Organization study called Nutrition and Disease, where they looked at the 20 largest killers of human beings and is there a nutrition link? Well, they couldn't find a single disease that didn't have a profound nutrition link. And why is that an issue? Because the modern medical machine does 40 minutes of nutrition in a 7-year degree. So how are you ever equipped to be able to solve problems rather than treat symptoms? And so the model has become a symptom treating model, and that has backfired, as I also touched upon this afternoon, to the point that our largest killer is heart disease, with cancer about to take over, and number 3 is prescription medicine. Our medicine has become our 3rd largest killer, and that's an indication of the bankruptcy of the symptom treating model. You just keep treating symptoms rather than there's a root cause. It's not bad luck when you get cancer or you get a fungal disease on a crop. There's a reason always for that, and that reason invariably comes back to nutrition, minerals, microorganisms and humus and their interplay. So there's been other changes. I mean, farmers markets, we've got 62 farmers markets on the Sunshine Coast now between Monday and Sunday. That's part of this concept of people want to know. It's everywhere you go, it's spray-free, spray-free. It don't have to be organic, but spray-free is on half of every stall. There's a sign saying spray-free. And the most common comment you'll hear at the 15,000 people, for example, who go to the Andina markets on a Saturday morning, has this been sprayed? Everyone asks it. That's the new generation. I've got 4 children. They won't eat chemical food, and they're certainly not interested in chemical agriculture. So that's the new emerging market, and the farmers markets are an example of people wanting to know who grew their food and how they grew it. Now, there's a wonderful movement called Kelso in Japan, where there's a whole really large supermarket chain that isn't the supermarkets, the Coles and Woolies that rip off the farmers non-stop. Farmers have become like serfs to that corporate model. This is farmers selling directly in a cooperative to consumers, and your food has your table and your photo behind of yourself, your family, your workers, your philosophy. And if you're not producing food with forgotten flavours and less chemicals and so forth, people don't come to your table and you're out, mate. It's self-policing. Wonderful, wonderful model, working tremendously well. So that's called putting a face to your food. So conventional agriculture, when we look at the climate change story and the importance of it. I'm working in so many countries and getting so many reports back, and it's just ridiculous what's unfolding from a climate perspective and the extremes that we're seeing. Conventional agriculture, 25% of the world's CO2, 60% of the methane. This is the big one that's not talked about. You might say, but nitrous oxide, that's only 5.5% of the pie, and it is, but it's 310 times more thickening of that blanket than CO2, and agriculture is responsible for 80% of it because of mismanagement of nitrogen. So a huge part of what I teach, how can you do that better? And it's not even hard. It's mismanaged so horrifically. It's really easy to make the change without sacrifice. The important thing to understand, and it's a sad thing, but no one talks about it, if the whole world was to wake up tomorrow and say, yeah, the shit's hit the fan, we're in real trouble, we're cutting carbon emissions tomorrow morning by 100%, the whole world, never going to happen. But what would happen if we chose to do that? Well, in 200 years' time, we'd be down to the levels of CO2 that we had in 1975. That's still too high. This has been happening for decades. It's now getting serious, so we're noticing it. But the oceans continue to heat, the oceans continue to acidify, and there's no one out there who understands the model who will tell you that there's 200 years left. So the model doesn't work. It helps, but it doesn't work. And you might say, is it all over bar the shouting? And it's not, because there's a solution, and that solution lies in the whole concept. Is it possible? Well, the Americans put out 8.25 billion tonnes of the 34.2 billion tonnes that go up there every year. So, 5% of the world's population put up 20% of the CO2. So you can imagine if you're a third world country suffering famine and drought and you've got no carbon footprint, you might feel a bit embittered by these people who are putting out way more than their share. But if we took just cultivated soils in the US and we built 1% organic matter, which is doable, difficult, but doable, much easier to do in what's called intelligent grazing, which is how we graze our animals, and untouched the fungal component, which is really important in this building of stable humus, really can build humus fast and grazing soils. In fact, there's a very strong argument to say that animals literally can save the planet, which is hard for the vegans amongst us, because someone's got to eat them or we don't have them. But if you look at the figures, and there's some tremendous research to support it, intelligent grazing. So what is intelligent grazing? Okay, if we're going to adhere to the definition of science as adherence to natural laws and principles, okay, what can we learn from nature? Let's look at the most productive areas in the history of mankind and why were they productive. Well, number 2 was the Nile Valley until we dammed it, and that was just because this massive silt was spread across the plains and you could produce these wonderful food, wonderful quality soil, and then we dammed it and that doesn't happen anymore. But the most productive soil, by far, more organic matter produced per square metre than anywhere ever, then or now, in the history of mankind, and it did it for thousands of years until we stepped and turned it into a dust bowl in 60 years. That was called the Great Plains. And what drove that phenomenal production, without urea and DAP and whatever, basically it was buffalo, huge herds of bison, predator effect keeps you close together, you're not choosy about what you eat, massive amounts of urine and dung, but the lesson from nature was how those animals operate. They never, ever grazed below 4 inches. The herd moved on, came back, 6 months later or whatever. Massive biostimulation, tramping of some of that organic matter into the soil with all the biostimulation of the feeding of the microbes that then took that organic matter and converted it to humus to drive that whole operation. Obviously, large amounts of NPK and so forth naturally in the urine, more in urine than there is in dung, incidentally. But why did they stop? Well, it's real simple. Just take a shovel out in the paddock. If you've got 6 inches above ground and you're producing through photosynthesis sugar that's feeding the bottom half, you feed the same amount, basically. If you've got 12 inches, 30 centimetres above ground, you've got 30 centimetres of roots below ground. If you graze down to 15 centimetres, you can't sustain 30 centimetres of roots, so the roots prune themselves to 30 centimetres. If you graze down to 2 inches, the roots prune themselves to 2 inches. If you take it to the tabletop, which is half the world, your dad said, take it to the dirt boy, you missed it. Your dad was wrong, horribly wrong. Because what you've done is shut down the entire system. You've got no solar panel, you've got no production of sugar, you've got no feeding the microbes. You've got to start on the hind legs and rear back slowly and gradually, and it's just a pathetic model, an absolutely pathetic model. And so the model is, okay, let's learn from that. And you can look at the work of people like Alan Savory and so forth, but there's all over the world now, there's farmers, my partner being one of them, farming with cell grazing. and mimicking that model. You've got to have waterways and you've got to have electric fences and you bring them into shorter, and you almost can't have too many animals in one area, it's just how long you leave them there. I'll give you an example. Simone Laurie, one of my clients, they farmed 2,200 acres in the Rockhampton region. And one morning she wakes up, she's got this 20,000 bequest from an uncle who died that's in her private account because it was her uncle. She says, I've been thinking overnight and I've decided I want to challenge, I want to bet you $10,000 that I can take 200 acres of our 2,200 acres and in 3 years make more money than you're making from the remaining 2,000. He said, bring it on, girl, thinking he was in the money. It was a serious bet. 3 years later, she collected her 10,000 and she did. She collected it and put it, she's got 30,000 in her account now. They've got a shared account and they've got her own account. But how did she do it? Well, she split that 200 acres into 20 10-acre paddocks. She planted a fast-growing leguminous shrub called Lakina, and she brought in 630 head of cows for 1 day, 20-day cycle. Can't quite keep that up in winter when it slows back in that region, but for the months, the 8 or 9 months you can, you've got this 20-day cycle. And I'm back on her farm 3 years later, 2 years, sorry, she collected the money. I'm back 3 years later looking at her latest soil test. I'm looking at her former soil test. I'm saying, Simone, you cheated. I won't tell him, but you spent $1,000 a hectare here. You've doubled your organic matter, slightly more than doubled. You've improved your all-important calcium to magnesium ratio. It's a really important ratio that determines how well the soil can breathe. Your trace minerals have all lifted. Everything's changed here. You put on trace minerals, you put on compost, you put on some lime. So you don't spend 1 cent. I use my livestock as my principal fertility tool, and that, my friends, is how the Great Plains did it for hundreds of thousands of years until we stepped in and messed it up in that very short time. So that the importance of animals and intelligently grazed animals is mind-boggling, to the point that they're probably the biggest tool to save the day. And we need to understand that. So, continuing. So if we were to build our 1%, that pulls back 4.5 billion of that 8.2 billion tonnes, and that's more than what you actually need to do to save the day. So it's actually doable. We just got to start doing it yesterday. And thankfully this change is underway, so I'm excited that something's happening. So our only response to global warming has been to talk about reducing CO2. We talked about the figures, and is it all over? And no, it's not. It's completely doable. So the carbon load from the soil is the chief culprit that's thickening the blankets. Just so you know, since 1860, 250 gigatons have gone up from industry and coal-fired power stations. 476 gigatons, almost double, has come from the soil. The solution, put it back from where it came. When you build organic matter, you can't make new carbon. You've stepped into the carbon cycle and you're sequestering carbon that it would otherwise have returned to the atmosphere. So it's really, really important. But one of the most important parts of that equation, when we look at the soil life community, you've got bacteria, you've got fungi, you've got earthworms, you've got protozoa, you've got nematodes, and 80% of them are actually good guys and 20% of them are bad guys, and the list goes on. You've got algae and so forth. But what's lacking in almost every soil life test that you do is these beneficial fungi. And why are they important? Well, there's 2 types of carbon, and you need to understand this. You can take your lawn clippings and pile them in a corner and come back with a second barrow and put your hand into the first pile and it's red hot. Now that's bacteria chasing what bacteria need, and bacteria have every creature has what's called a carbon to nitrogen ratio. We're 30 to 1, trees are 500 to 1, nematodes are 100 to 1, bacteria are 5 to 1. That's the tightest ratio of any creature on the planet, which means effectively that 17% of their body, 5 to 1, 5 and 1, 6 into 100, it's about 17% is pure nitrogen, which means they go crazy on nitrogen. So that's what they're chasing in the lawn clippings, because the green pigment is nitrogen, and those tiny little things, 500,000 on a pinhead, but the equivalent of 5 cows per hectare in weight. So there's just huge numbers on a healthy soil of bacteria, and they've come woofing into that lawn clippings because it's non-fibrous and it's perfect. It's got all the nitrogen that they need, and they turn that into a humus, into a compost, and that's called active humus. And you put that in your garden and you put it on at the rate of 100 tonnes per hectare, because you can. It's just a little garden, and the soil turns 3 shades darker, and you come back 6 months later for your second crop cycle and it's back to its ordinary colour. That's called active humus. It oxidises and returns to the atmosphere. So that's not what you're going to get paid carbon credits for. When fungi come into the equation, they'll take some of that humus, they'll make some themselves, they'll tie it with their little hyphae and wrap up and create this clay humus crumb, and that's called stable humus, and it lasts for 35 years minimum. It'll be here after most of us have gone. And that's what we need desperately, is to bring these fungi, these beneficial fungi, back into the equation, because there's a little tool that we use. I don't know if I've got it, it's down there, but I won't pull it all apart. It's called a microbiometer. It's really inexpensive, but it will give us total microbial biome. That's how much workforce have you got in your soil, and we'll be demonstrating some of these things on the farm day. And it tells us the all-important fungi to bacteria ratio. It's so important, that ratio, because of a whole variety of things, but one of them is just how well the soil breathes is governed by fungi that create these larger aggregates and this larger crumb structure that allows the soil to breathe better. But they create the carbon that will stay there after we've gone, and they're not there. Every soil you look at, you need a 1-to-1 ratio on this little meter. It's just a $300 meter. It's a wonderful tool. And most people have got 90% bacteria and 10% fungi, and that's really serious. It's the biggest thing we need to change. But what's exciting about it from a growing perspective is that it's not a sacrifice, it's actually a win-win scenario. I had not huge, but 250 farmers with Nicole Masters, who's a very good New Zealand consultant, in New Zealand just prior to COVID. We had 5 farmers from 5 countries, large-scale farmers in various different enterprises, but they all had the same story. When they improved their fungi to bacteria, up came their property, in came their farming fund returned, the stress dropped. That was the turning point. And so, you know, you're doing something that's going to be of such immense value from a planetary perspective in terms of creating stable carbon that'll be there for 35 years. And the payback is you're going to do the best you ever did. So it's a wonderful win-win scenario. It's almost like we're at the dawn of the golden era of agriculture, because you're going to get paid to do that. And that's what carbon credits is emerging as a whole big business unto itself in terms of building humus. So, and we mentioned mycorrhizal fungi, just one of those fungi that are now just 10% left in our soil. So we need to change that. So humus is the sweet-smelling, chocolate colour substance that's created by microorganisms, and it becomes their home base and their support system. And it's the storage and delivery system for everything. So how's minerals held in the soil? You put in some nitrogen or anything, calcium or whatever, into your soil, how does it not just leach? Well, you've got clay colloids, little particles of clay that hold positively charged minerals called cations, and then you've got humus that also has got little Velcro strips to hold on to positive, but it's the only thing that holds very leachable, negatively charged mineral. It has these second little sites with positively charged Velcro strips, so it holds everything. The only thing in the soil that holds all minerals is humus. So it's really important for the nutrient density and medicinal value of our food that we bring back and improve. What we see is that the disease suppressive soils that don't need chemical intervention are those with the highest levels of humus. The higher the humus, the greater the nutrient density and medicinal value, the less the need for stressful pest management, and the greater your gardening or farming pleasure is what we see. Now we suggest that everyone does need to do a soil test and understand what they need. It's like driving down a highway with a blindfold on, not to know what your soil's, you can't guess with what's required in the soil, and so many people do. So it's really important. This is just to understand how minerals work. It's a chart by a professor developed 35 years ago. It's called Mulder's chart, but the solid line is antagonism. So too much of one mineral will antagonise the uptake of another, and some minerals stimulate the uptake of other minerals. So if you've got an arrow moving in that direction, you see nitrogen stimulates magnesium uptake, or molybdenum stimulates copper uptake, for example. And we see this interplay of high phosphorus shuts down potassium, and high calcium shuts down potassium as well, and so forth. And so, you have this on your wall if you're a farmer, and you get your soil test back and you can understand a little bit. And then you do a leaf test, because the soil test is just telling you what the soil needs. A leaf test is telling you which one of these is affecting which and how in your soil conditions. So the leaf test is just saying, what do you want, plant? Oh, that's what you want. And then you bypass the soil and you foliar spray. Direct injection of the foliar spray, 12 times more efficient at delivering nutrition, and you bypass these lock-up problems associated with having too much of one thing or whatever, and then you've got this nutrient-dense, high bricks, as we touched upon today, food that changes. So just to see how antagonism works, everything in that quartile, like if you do too much lime, because you don't know how much your soil needs, you don't understand that it can hold 2 tonnes and you put on 4 tonnes, then lime will shut down those other 5, the calcium will shut down those other 5 minerals. High magnesium will shut down everything else in that group. you put too much gypsum on, the sulfur component will shut down phosphorus and it'll shut down nitrate, nitrogen. High iron soils, big problem here because that's what red coloured soils are going to affect manganese and zinc, for example. So you'd want to watch out for those two on your leaf test. And so it's just an understanding of how minerals interplay. So how do you build humus if we understand it's the most? So we look at the National Bank and they said, okay, we've got this model of get big or get out. And so people are coming to us, we need to buy our neighbour's farm and to make ourselves more profitable, more efficient. And so we look at, there's a whole set of criteria. Can you qualify for the loan? You tick the boxes, yes, sometimes no, but usually yes, you've qualified. And then a huge percentage of those loans are falling over. And so there's something wrong with their set of criteria. So the National Bank in the Hillston region, New South Wales, on 800 farms over 3 years looked at everything. Was it the size of your tractor? Was it how much NPK fertiliser? Was it your marketing skills or your accounting skills? Which it could be. You can grow the best food in the world if you don't sell it. Then what's the point if you don't know how to sell it? They looked at everything, and to the absolute shock and surprise, not horror because it was, it was an interesting finding, the number one determinant of profitability in agriculture was the percentage of organic matter in your soil. That's how important it is. I mean, it literally, they put a value of the land per hectare based on every 0.15% increase. They said that soil is worth so many $1,000s per hectare more just based on the organic matter because that reflected the productive potential. So it's a wonderful scenario that we're now being paid, or we're soon to be paid, to build the very thing that makes us more profitable and more productive. So it's a great outcome. But just let's look at some of the things you might do either in the garden or on the farm. One of those is the idea of including legumes in every scenario, particularly in a home garden. And the most important, it's a permaculture principle, is the idea of interplanting lucerne, this legume called lucerne. And the leaves, you can buy lucerne pills because they're wonderfully alkalizing and really, really nutrient dense, but the young leaves are really quite edible and you can put them into salads. The edible flowers, this is just an absolute, who's ever eaten a lucerne flower? Yeah, I mean, they're just the sweet, delicious thing you can put on salads, and they're filled with antioxidants. That purple colour, the intense colours are always about specific antioxidants. But the big thing is this concept of chopping and dropping. So you grow the lucerne up, perhaps you harvest the flowers or whatever, and then you chop and drop it, and you just go through with a brush cutter, and that mulch becomes this remarkable. There is nothing better, there's no better fertilising mulch than lucerne. Lucerne has this wonderful 30-to-1 carbon and nitrogen ratio, which is the very best. Compost has that. And earthworms love it. It's filled, once it dries, it harbours these organisms called protozoa. And protozoa are the favourite food for earthworms, so the earthworms come back. It's just a wonderful model. And of course, the earthworms are, as we mentioned, massively important in the story. The other concept that home gardeners perhaps don't do, but probably should, and certainly every farming scenario, whenever there's soil bare, I mean, the obvious thing we're learning from nature, because that's what science is, adherence to natural laws and principles. When does nature ever leave soil bare? Never. Nature abhors a vacuum. Something, weeds, anything pops up there because you've got to have coverage. The plants are feeding that army of organisms. There's no plants, there's nothing. You've got nothing holding it together, you've got nothing shading, nothing protecting it. It's just a stupid idea. The idea of chemical fallow, just leaving soils completely bare, is an absurd idea, to say the very least. It's the least scientific principle that I can personally think of. Phenomenon globally is the idea of not just putting a couple of plants in there, like some rye or some clover, but this concept of cocktail cover crops. And it comes from a Brazilian scientist called Ademir Caligari, who's worked his whole life on cover crops. And he's discovered if you can combine 5 groups of plants within a cover crop, and you might have 2 or 3 of each, the more the merrier is how nature works. But 5, you've got to have the 5. And so he was training a group of farmers who call themselves the Carbon Cowboys in 2 states in the US who were putting these principles into practice. And they started reporting these ridiculous changes in soil structure as if they'd just done 4 cover crops in 1 cover cropping cycle. And so a friend of mine, Ron Nichols, who heads the Soil Health Division of the US Ag Department, he took a team of researchers out and said, how's this happening? First of all, it was pretty easy to see it was happening. You could push a penetrometer and it would go to the base, push straight through these beautiful soils that have been created, in some cases just with a single cover crop. No one's seen anything like it before. So they said, what's happening? And what they discovered was only when you've got the 5 families, you've got 4 of them, it doesn't happen. The plant roots begin messaging each other, and all 5 families start outpouring these substances into the soil called phenolic compounds. Now, phenolic compounds are the most powerful antioxidants. That's the reason that we might eat dark chocolate or green tea or blueberries or whatever, because it's phenolic compounds that are of wonderful benefit to our health. Well, it turns out that the soil life has similar benefits, and when these 5 plants together, only when there's 5 in the mix, when they start messing with each other and pouring out these compounds, soil life goes into hyperdrive and delivers all these things much more rapidly than otherwise. It's a wonderful Nobel Prize winning type of finding. And what are the 5 families? Grasses, cereals, brassicas, legumes. Now that's a fairly common mixture, not that common, a reasonably common mixture within a cover crop blend if you could source some cover crop seed, but this is the one that's missing. And it's only 1% required of the whole mix, but it's called, it looks like it's pronounced chenopods, but it's called quinopods. And what are quinopods? Well, they're everything from the beet family. So usually if you're in a country that grows sugar beet, that's the cheap version. So you get some sugar beet seed, 1% in your blend. But everything from the beet family, quinoa, amaranth, and spinach. That's a really small group. But you only need 1%. I use a cheap commercial silver beet seed, just 1% in the blend. But once you do it yourself, you sort of, this is a picture, I don't know if that was my cover crop or not, but it looks very much like that. And this is the 5 species are in there. There's a brassica that's called forage kale. You can eat most of the stuff if you want to in salads, but the change that happens in your soil, you really, really get excited when you see that change. The brassicas, you never have more than 5% within the mix, because they pour out a biochemical that will reduce mycorrhizal colonisation in the plant growing right next to the brassica. So you don't want to have too many of them in there, but they serve quite a purpose at that 5 to 6% of the blend. So that's just a wonderful finding. We need to have home gardeners doing that wherever they can in that model. Who's heard of humic acid before? So not many of you, but humic acid is, humic and fulvic acid together are called humates. And they're created when you compost. I mean, you could actually analyse your compost now at what percentage of humic and fulvic's in there, and that's a direct measure of the quality of that of that compost. So humic acid is produced by fungi in the compost, fulvic acid is produced by bacteria, and those 2 substances remain the most powerful stimulants of those 2 organisms. So humic acid is the most powerful known fungal stimulant, and that's certainly important at this point in time where every soil needs more fungi. So bringing some of this natural acid. So what's been found is you can extract this material. You don't have to necessarily get it from compost. You can extract it from ancient organic matter in the forms of certain types of brown coal, and it's quite an easy process to pull out the soluble form of it, and then you introduce that as a fungal stimulant into your soil, and it can be a wonderful benefit. Could arguably be one of the most important things out there at the moment because it's so powerful at building fungi. Compost itself, I mean, the prime example of the importance of compost is not necessarily about the humic and fulvic or the minerals that are complex within that compost, but it's about the humus building potential. So I mentioned that friend Ron Nichols from the Soil Health Division. He shared with me a study where they put 1 tonne of compost on multiple sites in 2 states over 3 years. So that's just 3 tonnes, this is per acre. 3 tonnes of compost per acre. Now just so you understand the equation, it takes 6 tonnes of pure carbon in the 6 inches of 1 acre to lift organic matter by 1%. So how does that translate to compost? Compost is about 30% carbon. So it's about 20 tonnes of compost per acre will lift organic matter by 1%. Well, they put on 3 tonnes. So that's an increase, theoretically, of what you put on over 3 years should have increased organic matter by 0.15%. That's what it comes at. 20 takes 1%, 0.15% for just 3 instead of 20, roughly. And so that's what you should have seen when you did your soil test before and after. What they saw, averaged over multiple sites in 2 states, was an increase of 1.35%. You put on 0.15%, you got 9 times more. That, my friends, is what makes compost so immensely important at this point in time, because it triggers your soil, it reclaims your soil's capacity to build humus, to take some of that carbon as it comes down as the roots, as they die off the crop residues, as they appear, and convert them more efficiently into this all-important humus. So compost is so important. And that once you start making compost, and there's no reason that anyone on the island here couldn't be making compost, you get real passionate when you see what it can do for your soil. It tends to, I've got a friend who's a broadacre farmer who got into composting, and he's been hit 3 times with these extremes. He's had 3 hurricanes and 3 cyclones and up in Rockhampton. And then he had a 4th, and I rang him because I'd been there talking the day before as this this low formed and turned into a category 4 in 24 hours, which has never happened that we know of in the history of mankind. And that happened 2 months later in Mexico. But that hit him, and I rang him to commiserate. I said, oh my God, you must be, fourth time. He said, oh my God, there's trees down everywhere, but oh my God, I can do so much composting now. And that's what you start seeing the cup half full when you get into composting. It is so much fun. We're composting as we speak at the farm at the moment, and I wish I was there because it's a really fun thing to do. So composting, really important. How can you do it? Well, it's pretty simple. I mean, basically aside from that re-triggering your soil's capacity to build humus, I mean, you're introducing, if we say, okay, what's the central principle of nature? So we're learning from nature, that's definition of science, adherence to natural laws and principles. So what's the central principle of nature? It's pretty simple, one word, biodiversity. That's the whole driving thing of nature. The more the merrier is how nature works. And so we said, we're just, bugger that, we're just going to do monoculture. So we plant one orchard, one species, one vegetable crop, whatever. We did the opposite. It's anti-science. We did the opposite of how nature works. You take one species. See, the thing to understand is that every plant doesn't just feed glucose, 30% of its glucose to look after the microbes. It laces that glucose according to its requirements. So if you're a banana plant and you've got a really strong need for manganese, that mineral you do. If you're a banana plant, you've got twice the need for manganese compared to a soy plant, for example. So you lace your glucose that you're giving to your army of workforce beneath your feet, your external stomach, you lace that with nutrients that feed manganese-reducing organisms so you get more manganese. Well, every plant has its own unique requirements. It's hugely different between different plants. You've got one plant, you're feeding one group of organisms, and then there's no diversity, so pathogens can come in and the same insect will come into the same crop. You really created your own liability. And why cover cropping, this multi-species thing is important, is because you can counter that. You can put a multi-species cover crop under your orchard. You can bring that into every opportunity you can to counter what was essentially a mistake, which was anti-nature, the concept of a monoculture. So no difference in the soil, it's bringing back that biodiversity, and that's what composting allows you to do. And it can be really, really simple to set up a compost station or to do vermicomposting. You can do it with this. We give these away free at Nutritech, and if you can get the hardwood ones, you just use a 4-inch nail and you just nail them together. You don't need any other, you don't even need star pickets. They'll hold together with their own weight. These are pines, so you probably have got a star picket in there somewhere. But they'll hold together really firmly. It's quite hard to drive those nails through the hardwood. But then you put shade cloth and you staple it with a staple gun around the outside edges. You line this as well, so it's breathing beautifully. And you've got 3 tons of compost. You've got 3 alternating compost bins just in a home garden scenario. It's not expensive. It's not difficult to do. The concept of commercial composting, all of the main commercial systems use the same thing. You alternate. It's quite simple. You make a layer cake. You have a carbon layer, you have a nitrogen layer. So carbon's brown stuff, nitrogen's green stuff, or manure, which of course has got high nitrogen. So you alternate either the manure and the brown stuff, the wood chip or some straw or whatever, and you just have your layer, and you set it up in layers so that you can water down that layer and have that moisture, because you can't make a whole pile and then water it and get it all wet. So you'll have areas that aren't cooking and aren't working. So you always do it as a layer cake. And then you can sprinkle things on there. You can sprinkle things like a little lime. Everyone does lime. You can put some previous compost as an inoculum. You can do a little bit of crusher dust. There's a reason for that. We won't get into that depth, but it's very, very simple. And you wet down each level, build up your layer cake, and then you've got to turn it. If you do an aerobic compost, there's also a thing called an anaerobic compost where you don't even turn it. We'll talk about that if we get a chance. In fact, we're going to talk about it now. This is just our product. There's also a product called EM that's been out there for a long time. Or you can make it yourself. You can make what's called a lactobacillus tea, and these are beneficial. This is the same organisms in our gut and on our skin, but the question that the Japanese professor asked was, why are they everywhere? Why are they on every plant, every soil? And he developed this thing called EM because he found they do the same things, these anaerobes, as what beneficial organisms do. They make carbon, they create nitrogen, fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, and they do a whole range of exactly the same roles. And so he created this thing called EM, and we've got a sort of a copied version. It's got a few more organisms in it called BAM, but it's real. You can brew it up. I'm going to teach on the farms how easy it is to do that, or even make your own. You make it from rice, your own lactobacillus tea. That it's stable for 2 years, so you make it from the paddock, and you never do anything without putting microbes behind the minerals. If we talk about how to how do plants uptake nutrition, particularly from a foliar perspective. The stomate is a little mouth underside each leaf that is there to suck up CO2, but that mouth can open up to 7 times its normal size. And so one of the things that will trigger stomatal opening is if you're putting out say a foliar spray of minerals and you put microbes with it, the microbes with their outpouring of CO2, that's a triggering mechanism to open up that mouth, and now you feed the nutrients into that open mouth. So it's a tremendous tool to combine minerals and microbes together. But you can make a compost without turning it with BAM by covering it like a silage heap. You make your pile, you cover it, and 8 weeks later you've got this beautiful compost with no work. So it's just a whole new thing that's emerging, this anaerobic composting idea. Minimising digging. Now, how did we lose so much of our humus? Because every time you open a soil, you oxidise some of the organic matter. That's how it works. And if you do that wet, you quadruple that loss of carbon that was in the soil now in the blanket trapping the heat changing our world. So obviously it's a pretty good thing with your gardening or farming to minimise tillage. And the ideal thing is to have this mulch, a layer of mulch, some of which can be created with a lucerne, that you're cutting and dropping. But basically just build your mulch layer and plant directly into the mulch and don't dig it constantly. Sometimes you have to, but your carrots or something like that, you've got to have a fine tilth. But on many, many crops, we can minimise our tillage, and that makes a huge difference to carbon loss. And it's one of the biggest players on how we lost so much carbon was opening that soil. So no-till is a tremendous benefit in that context. I mean, 5 kilograms per square metre of soil up in your garden and farm, and this new understanding that the plant is actually eating the microbes, that you want to look after that soil life. It becomes, you say minerals, microbes, chicken and egg, which is more important? Well, probably the microbial side is the most important part of that equation. And we've ignored it for forever. Trying to limit the use of the world's most widely used chemical, glyphosate, is really important. It's just, I mean, if you go down to the local store and ask how much glyphosate they sell, you'll know how big it's, how many people are using it. It's just it's the world's most widely used chemical of any kind. It's billions and billions of tons that go out there. But Europe's looking at banning it by next year, and there's some very, very good reasons. It started with a friend of mine, Professor Don Huber, where he showed that this is something that happens. This is Roundup-ready soy. Now, you've basically genetically modified the plant so you can spray Roundup all over it and it'll kill the weeds in the middle, but it won't kill the soy. But it's a food crop and you spray it 3 times and now you're eating glyphosate. And you need to understand that you would think that the powers that be would look after us on this front, but we're allowed to import genetically modified soy flour into Australia, and every cheap supermarket loaf that you buy, if you have a look at the label, you've got to list labels in order of the percentage that's present in there. They don't necessarily have to list the percentage, but it'll be listed. That's labelling laws. Number 1 will be wheat, number 2 soy flour, and it's 30% of most loaves. And so you need to become a label Nazi and read the labels, particularly if you've got children, because we don't use any of our soy as all exported or turned into soy milk. We don't use that in our bread. We import the cheap 3 sprays of glyphosate onto that bread, and people need to know that when they're feeding children. You need to source bread that doesn't contain that. So once they realised that it was doing much more than what was thought of, they thought it was the safest of all chemicals. That's certainly how Monsanto sold it. Then the medical community, and now there are over 200 published papers, and it's a nightmare. I mean, some of the studies, chronic illness, people with exposure who've got higher levels in their blood, invariably are those that simply can't get well. I mean, you've got over 250 parts per million of most people with chronic illness. It's the biggest single common denominator in people with long-term illness is high blood levels of glyphosate. Beneficial gut bacteria, I mean, it's been banned for it was only used for animal health, animal feeding, soy and corn and so forth in Europe. And countries like Denmark have said, well, there's this massive increase in gut lesions and so forth linked to it. Huge increases in allergies, including the British Medical Council, when they started bringing in the cheap soy into England and putting it into the bread. The British Medical Council put this huge big memorandum out there that everyone signed saying they've never seen anything like it. There's this massive increase in gluten intolerance and in allergies in children because you're having a completely foreign protein. You put this genetically modified protein into the diet, into the food chain. It magnifies, so kids that have a bad response, and there's a few of them who have a bad response to vaccines, much more likely to react worse and have serious problems if they've got high levels of glyphosate. It makes the vaccines more toxic. Who would have thought there's actually a disease or a condition called glyphosate-induced vitamin deficiency that they now think is linked to childhood cancer? So it's actually a condition that's discussed, glyphosate-induced vitamin deficiency. Non-Hodgkin's, now this is the problem with Bayer, who bought Monsanto, is that they've had the biggest fall in a German company ever in history because they bought the liability. And the last two lawsuits that have gone through were $1 billion apiece. Well, I dined with the head of Bayer in Australia up at Townsville at a conference a couple of years back. I said, you must be fairly uncomfortable with 5,000 lawsuits when the last two were $1 billion apiece. He said, try 15,700 and 400 new ones each week. So they're not going to be here at some point, Bayer, unless they do some massive payout. But non-Hodgkin's, that's just really likely if you've had contact with it. And you see people out there with their shorts on, with this toxic chemical on a windy day. I mean, if it's on your skin, it's in your body. Just understand that. I mean, I don't know how I can be more graphic about understanding that. Like say you're magnesium deficiency, well, you can have an Epsom salts bath or spray magnesium on your skin, and that's a 10-fold increase in uptake versus having to go through the whole gut pathway. It's just straight through the skin into the blood. So if it's on your skin, it's in your blood. And farm chemicals, I mean, that's why farmers have got the highest cancer level, double the next highest profession. If it's on your skin, it's in your blood. I was sourcing some new drums for a natural insecticide we sell. It's called Nemor. And they changed the law and said you had to have this more heavy-duty drum, although it's completely non-toxic. But anyway, it's a whole different story. We're talking to a chemical supplier who had a source of the drums. He said, you guys are lucky. We're staring down the barrel of a lawsuit. And he told the story. Farmer standing at his workbench, and above him on a shelf's a drum of paraquat, which is a really nasty herbicide. And it split, really bad luck. And a bit squirted from the little split, hit him on the back and then it ran down his neck. He knew it's concentrated, he knew he was in trouble. He's frantically trying to clean it off and run to the shower in the back of the house, 500 metres, fell on his knees twice and vomited, got to the back door and died. The two dogs who ate his vomit, they died as well. That's through his skin and in his body in that short of time. That's what you've got to understand when you're dealing out there with your shorts on spraying glyphosate. You are crazy. You've got to look at some of the research. I mean, all of us have this gene called cytochrome P450. It's actually called the lucky bastard gene because it's inherited. We've all got it, but some of us have got, that's not the microbial side of the equation, but it's this bomb-proof clean-up system, gene system that detoxes your body, enzyme system that detoxes your body. We all have it. Some of us just have got better ones than others, but it really debilitates that system. Well, gee, we don't want that in a world with 74,000 registered chemicals. So it debilitates that. And then we've got kidney failure. Now, it used to be that 1 in 10 people in intensive care die from kidney failure. It's now 4 in 10 that die from kidney failure, and there's a massive link to glyphosate. It really affects your kidneys. So, it's a big story, and if you can avoid using it at home or on your farm, I suggest you do that. So why are earthworms so important? This bloke, this is his hole. No one else can go down there. He'll fight to the death for it. He comes up each night, he grabs a bit of organic matter, dead organic matter like thatch on the bottom of the grass or whatever. He takes that down and composts it 4 times faster than any other known form of composting to create humus. He drops this little bundle at the top. This becomes a wonderful airway for oxygen to come in and CO2 to come out. So that's called gas exchange. So it's a wonderful tool. You don't have to run over your paddock with spiked rollers to get the soil breathing. You've got this happening beautifully, but inside that burrow is the highest counts of microorganisms that you will ever find in the soil. And the earthworm layers as he comes down, like setting a crab pot, a wonderful array of food for microbes, and the numbers build to massive numbers. And when he comes up a few nights later, he sucks like a vacuum cleaner, and he sucks up this microbes that he's created, comes up, drops his poo, comes back down again. Now, in his gut, he incubates a unique range of organisms of tremendous benefit in the soil that you simply can't get anywhere else. They're only incubated from an earthworm's gut, and that poo contains those wonderful organisms. So organisms that fix nitrogen, protect from disease, that make minerals available, solubilise phosphorus and so forth. But the holy grail of what we call nutrition farming or nutrition gardening is to aim for 25 earthworms per shovel over usually 3 tests during the year, because sometimes they go down when it's dry and so forth. But if you can get 25 earthworms per shovel, you've created 300 tonnes of this stuff. And what's this stuff? Well, there it is there. It's basically a fertiliser machine. 10 times more potassium, 7 times more nitrogen, 5 times more phosphorus, 3 times more magnesium. I mean, calcium is the most abundant mineral. You can't have 10 times more, but it's 150% more. And how's that? He's got a little calciferous gland. He spits out calcium carbonate and adds it to everything that goes through him. So you've got a fertiliser factory and a lime works in one. I mean, you can't do better. And you've got an aerating machine and you've got an incubator of incredibly precious soil life. And they're gone from most of our soils, so we need to bring them back. And it becomes a major thing to do it. And then you could say, it's turned into a whole big market, the concept of worm juice. And what you need to know about that is that you can take, that little bit of liquid that comes out the bottom of your little home worm farm or the bigger 1,000-litre containers or whatever that we use. And that's what people have done. It's called leachate. But if you take that vermicast and you create what's called an extract, so if you've got a home system with some vermicast in it, and you put that into, take a shovelful of it and put it into a bucket, and then you put a hose and blast it and stir it for 4 or 5 minutes, sometimes even 6 or 7 minutes, and then you let that settle, and that's called an extract rather than a leachate. And if you use that little microbe machine that we mentioned to see microbial biomass, you will have 3 or 4 times more numbers and diversity that you've extracted from that. And that's the new way to work with liquid vermicasters, to create an extract, which means you can put them in big containers and swirl it around with pumps and so forth and pull out all those microbes and that diversity of microbes. And it's really, really neat stuff. It's so easy to do in a home scenario. So this is how we make worm farms on our farm. We basically cut the top right, if you can picture it, we cut this top part off. This has already been done. We cut that through with a grinder and we cut the plastic as well. So you've got this plastic sleeve with a lid on it. You put that plastic sleeve on the ground, you drill hundreds of little 1.5 mil holes for the cordless drills. You go bzz, bzz, bzz all over it, create a sieve even through the lid. Then you take that, you've now got an open tank, because this isn't on there initially once you've cut that off, and you drop that onto the bottom, and what that creates mirrors this area here. That creates a 120 litre reservoir conveniently where there's already a tap place. You put it on some blocks so that you can get a 20 litre bucket under it, and that becomes your extraction of the vermicast with that leachate model, which is still a value, but it's nowhere near as good as an extract. And then you put on a 2x2 frame that you bolt onto this top bar that remains up here, and then you put another 2x2 frame that you screwed together and hinge it to the back with a bit of iron on top, and that's your lid, and now you've got a worm bin. You go down to Bunnings and you buy, well, you can't go to Bunnings here, but you get yourself some cocoa peat, a bale of cocoa peat, $15, put it into a barrow, put 3/4 of the water in the barrow, fill it up. You think it's too much, but it's not. You've got this 3/4 barrow full of this lovely moist mulch, and that becomes the home base that starts the worms. Then you buy your first kilo, costs $100, and you put it in there, and every 6 weeks it doubles. You feed it then with manure and food scraps and so forth, and every 6 weeks you've got double the number. And when they reach saturation point, which might be 6 or 8 months down the path, they stop breeding. Unlike humans, they stop breeding. So then you sell them. You take out your kilo, or you make new bins, as we do, and it's a wonderful. Worm farms are a wonderful do-it-yourself living fertiliser for less than $200. Now, so that's a really good strategy, and as we mentioned, wonderful way to build organic matter. Basically, this is just the concept of making compost teas or using beneficial inoculums, anaerobic ones or aerobic ones. You can brew them aerobically or anaerobically. It's very simple to do. I'll teach that on the farm when we're out there. But we send those inoculums, those living organisms, even the worm juice, it goes to work with a lunchbox. So if you can include some molasses or some fish or some kelp or whatever in with those microbes, they hit the ground running, subdividing as fast as they can subdivide, and you do even better, we find. So that's part of our strategy. And the most important substance is not N, it's not P, it's not K, it's not calcium, which is actually more important than the big three. The most important single substance to grow actually on the planet for all living carbon-based life forms is called oxygen. You last 2 minutes if we close off your airways. Well, everything's got to have oxygen. The organisms around the roots, the plant roots, use oxygen for everything. And so your principal role when you're growing things is that you're managing something called gas exchange. How freely does oxygen, it's called diffusion, moves from a high concentration, can't help itself, from high concentration of the atmosphere to a lower concentration. But how freely can it diffuse into the soil? The organisms use it, the roots use it, and then they breathe out, and they breathe out CO2, and now you've got a high concentration, so it diffuses, moves out of the soil, and the plant leaves waiting with little pores called stomates that suck up that CO2, combine it with water and sunlight, and that's how you grow stuff. That's called managing gas exchange. The better you do that, the better you do. So you're managing how freely oxygen comes in and how freely CO2 comes out. On tight, closed soils, there's a ratio called the calcium to magnesium ratio, and the importance of that ratio in a home garden or on the farm is massive because it's about gas exchange. Now here's how it works. Every mineral, it's called ionic radius, is a different size. And calcium is huge. It's like a beach ball, if you can picture it. And it's got two positive charges, so it grabs hold of nutrients on one side, so it can grab hold of a positively charged mineral like calcium on one side. Calcium can grab hold of the clay, which is negatively charged on one side, and it pushes apart the clay.
Sorry, right. I don't want to be rude.
Yeah.
And I know we've got a bit of time to go, but we just want to make sure that you get your dinner orders.
Okay.
We're going to organise.
You can just order for me, Sait, no worries.
Yes, but what do I do? Do I bring it here?
Or just see if they can stay. Yeah, I'll work on being. What time is it now?
It's 37 past.
So we've got 20 minutes, yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
we might
Yeah,
order
so-
takeaway and bring it back to you. So.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
I'll do that.
Thank you. Thanks for that.
Sorry.
So the most important ratio in minerals is, so the most important ratio in microbes is fungi to bacteria ratio, and we need more fungi, so we're going to look at how we can change that. But the most important mineral ratio is this ratio called the calcium to magnesium ratio. So I mentioned calcium is this big beach ball, and it's got two charges, and it grabs hold of a little ball of clay on each side, and it pushes apart the soil. That's called flocculation, and in comes the oxygen, and out comes the CO2. So calcium's, and then magnesium has also got two charges, but it's a golf ball, and it grabs hold of the clay and pulls it in. So you've got platform shoes in the wet. You've got a Sunday soil. You work at Sunday. Saturday you plant at Sunday. Monday it's already got too tight. And that's really bad. That's the soil that high magnesium soils can't breathe. The magnesium closes that soil. And so you can say, oh, well, don't worry about magnesium. We'll just do calcium. We'll just lime it. But you can't not worry about magnesium because you're doing two things. You're managing gas exchange, and you're doing a second thing when you grow stuff. You're a chlorophyll manager. You're managing the green pigment that houses the little sugar factories that make the glucose that drive everything. And chlorophyll is what that green pigment's called. You never want to see pale colours and blotches and stripes. That's poor chlorophyll management. It's called chlorosis. It means you haven't got sugar factories, you haven't got growing potential. So then we say, okay, well, how does that green pigment work? It's driven by magnesium. Magnesium's a centrepiece of chlorophyll with 4 nitrogens tagged onto it. You can put all the nitrogen in the world. If you don't have magnesium, what does it stick to? So you can't forget magnesium, and it turns out that there's a ratio in every soil that's appropriate to that soil, and it might be 4 to 1 or 5 to 1 or 6 to 1 on a heavy clay soil, 7 to 1. But if you understand that and a good soil test tells you that, then you get your soil breathing by correcting that calcium to magnesium ratio, and it's the biggest single game changer from a mineral balance perspective. Now, you might not be able to do that in a home garden scenario, but if you've got a tight soil, you need to get rid of some of that magnesium. And one tool is gypsum. That's why they call gypsum the clay breaker, because gypsum is called calcium sulfate. So you're bringing in some calcium into the equation, which you need obviously to open the soil, but you're also bringing sulfur, and the calcium sulfate breaks apart and it joins onto magnesium, and that forms magnesium sulfate, Epsom salts, and that's super leachable, and that pulls the magnesium out of your soil. So that's why you use gypsum to break up a tight closed soil and get that soil breathing. This is just, how important is pH. The pH, this is how much of this mineral is going into your food if you've got a home garden or you're growing food for sale. And you can see here, if you've neglected calcium or magnesium, the two main minerals that determine pH, well, look what you're losing. The thinner it is, the less of it there is in that food. The ideal pH is 6.4 right here. Interestingly, if you were to measure your saliva or your urine, the healthy human has a 6.4 pH. So that's the healthy pH in the soil, and there's a whole new finding now that you can squeeze a little bit of juice out of the leaf, and 6.4 is the healthy plant that can't get a fungal disease that's been found. So 6.4 is a magical figure. And you can see here all the bars, the minerals, are fattest, which means there's most of them going in at 6.4. That's the figure where everything is... Now, sometimes you can have a soil that's just very high in magnesium or sodium and you're up here, and that's harder to fix. Here it's just putting in some calcium, and sometimes calcium and magnesium together. But here, it's harder. How do you've got a pH of 8.5, and look what's all these things that are locked up here that you're not getting all these important trace minerals. Well, you foliar spray the trace minerals. That's what we teach our farmers to do. If you've got this kind of soil, you make up your own little mix if you want to do it cheaply, and you can add this material called fulvic acid, which collates that little mix, and you foliar spray that to compensate for what your soil's delivering. So it's just teaching how that whole thing works. Measuring soil pH, you can get little pH strips that can do it, and you mix 50% soil and 50% what's called deionized water, which is, you can buy it in the supermarkets. It's demineralized water because otherwise the minerals have an impact on things. And you mix half and half, and then you put in your little strip and measure where your pH is. So as we talked about, calcium is really important. This is the sort of similar thing to what we created for Norfolk, which has just got everything in it to try and address that. We talked about a refractometer. This is what you're looking at when you look through it, and where those lines meet, it looks like an old school fuel tank, and it kind of is, because that low Brix level is, a lack of nutrient density. It's also a very strong indication of a lack of calcium, because calcium is, that's why I say calcium is so important. Calcium is called the trucker of all minerals. Calcium directly impacts the uptake of 7 other minerals. And so the first thing you always look at, say in a home garden or even in a farming scenario, fix the calcium, find out how much you need in that soil and fix that if you can afford to, because it makes so much difference. And your refractometer will tell you whether you've done that successfully, because you never want to see this. You never want to see this sharp distinction between the two hemispheres. That's a screaming indication of a lack of calcium, which will also be a low Brix level because you haven't got the nutrient density of the 7 minerals that calcium carries into the plant. Calcium, the trucker of all minerals, as it's called. This is what you want to see, this blurry, fuzzy line, and of course it'll be a high Brix level as well, which indicates good calcium. So this little meter is not just about measuring your skills as a chlorophyll manager, it also gives you an indication of this very, very important mineral responsible for 7 other minerals being uptaken called calcium, so really important. There's all these different interrelationships, we won't spend too much time on it, but the story basically is to foliar spray so that you bypass lockups that are happening in the soil. Like lots of people put too much phosphorus on from chicken manure in home garden scenarios, and they've got ridiculous amounts, and then phosphorus shuts down calcium, potassium, zinc, iron and copper. So you just say, you can't fix that in the soil because the phosphorus is there and it keeps locking up everything. So you bypass and you foliar spray directly onto the leaf 12 times more efficiently. And it's a tremendous phenomenon in modern agriculture, is putting in things through the leaf where you can. That's the little stomates, and they're there, of course, to suck up CO2, but if you can get on the underside of the leaf when you're spraying, then you go directly into that mouth and you're straight into the plant. There's nothing more efficient. So you and you put the lucerne in the tank with the molasses and the fish, and you brew it for 2 days, bubbling. We have bubbling type brewing arrangement, and the protozoa come off and multiply. They come off the lucerne with a lid, all 3 forms of them. And you have, like, if you look under a microscope for 2 days, it's like sardines. They're quite visible because they're much bigger than bacteria. They're like a watermelon compared to a pea in terms of their size compared to a bacteria, so they're quite visible. And so he did those. He went back and said, I'll try that. Well, he put it out at quite a high rate, 50 litres a hectare. He had to brew 2 or 3 tanks to do his 40 acres. and 1,000 litre tanks. And and 8 weeks later, he went back and recounted it. And he's gone from 1 per 11 shovel to 11 per 1 shovel. Now that's just so you know is a 10,000-fold increase.
Wow.
And that's not because they bred up, because you only take 6 weeks to breed once, and you're only a tiny little worm at that point. That is, put it there and they will come. Protozoa's their favourite food, they just come from wherever. I've done it in my own raised beds and quadrupled my numbers in one application. So it's a really good tool to bring back evidence if you don't have them in your farming or gardening scenario. It's called a protozoa tea. It's a tremendous value when we look at what protozoa do. They're really important because they recycle nitrogen. One of those watermelon-sized protozoa eats 10,000 bacteria each day. And see, the deal is that bacteria filled with nitrogen.
Sorry, just interrupt. Can I just put this extra on?
Sure. I don't know, I'll just hold it. Bacteria are filled with nitrogen, and so I've lost where I was on this argument. So basically the protozoa are eating, they've got to constantly balance out their ratio. So they've got a 30-to-1 ratio, so they've got to eat 5 to 1. Every creature's got to balance its carbon and nitrogen. You're genetically keyed to do that constantly. So you eat 6 bacteria at 5 to 1, that gives you 6 5s is 30, but you only want 1 nitrogen. So 5 times you spit this excess nitrogen into the soil solution of the plant. Says, yes, your beauty, and sucks up the nitrogen. So it's this recycling technique for nitrogen that you lose if you don't have protozoa. So it's called grazing. They're there. They've got otherwise bacteria numbers just go huge, and they suck up all your nitrogen, so you can't grow your crop as well. And you bring back your protozoa to get that system, that nitrogen cycling happening. But there's more than that happening. There's this wonderful what's called root structure architecture happening, where one species, the biggest of the protozoa called amoeba, produce really large amounts of this hormone called auxins, which are root-stimulating hormones. And you see this visible branching of the roots associated with using your protozoa tea. Stimulates earthworms, of course, the big story. Even sort of like pruning trees, that the nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil, if you've got protozoa, they're more active. After they've been eaten by the protozoa, they come back stronger, sort of like pruning a tree. So it's a pretty good little tool. And we mentioned the use of either the do-it-yourself model, which you can make from milk, or EM, which is available in Australia, or this product of ours called BAM. This is the professor who asked the question, why are they everywhere? These beneficial anaerobes, they're in our gut, they're on our skin, they're on every plant surface, they're in every soil in huge numbers. And then he found that they did all these wonderful things. And so there's 80 different types of these anaerobes, beneficial anaerobes. You can make compost, you cover it over, that's what we're doing on the farm as we speak. We've got huge covers, 2 months, and you've got this beautiful compost, and you don't turn it. It's just a wonderful anaerobic composting. But what it does for the compost is quite neat, because a normal compost, you take a tonne of organic matter and you get 630 kilos from a tonne. With this material, because there's no off-gassing of CO2, it's all underneath the cover, you get 910 kilos, so you get like 30% more carbon in that model. So it's really quite special. Suppresses pathogens, they can control disease and so forth, these organisms, so you get a sort of a disease-suppressive soil. If you brew up these organisms, you can use them to speed the digestion of crop residues. They just get in and do that very, very quickly. You can use it as a probiotic for livestock and for pets. It's a wonderful living fertiliser. You can put 1/2 litre into your septic tank and it just takes all those smells away. You can even use it as a household cleaner. We sell our BAM product to a Sydney-based company who add essential oils to it and sell it as a household cleaner, and the organisms eat the mould off your shower and the residue off your kitchen bench. Wonderful. You know how I love dogs, but sometimes you pet a dog and your hand smells for a couple of hours. Well, you can spray this stuff on your dog and it doesn't smell. My daughter's got a dog that smells, it doesn't smell anymore. She just sprays it on and it takes rid of kills the organisms that create that anaerobic smell, just the same anaerobic smell that BO is based on. Spray it under your arms, you don't have BO. It eats the organisms that create that, anaerobic organisms that are there because there's no air under your arm, and that smell is what comes from those organisms. But BAM is a beneficial that eats those guys, so lots of benefits. So just concluding, last 5 minutes, there's a whole science now called biophilia that has shown that basically even if you put up a picture in the middle of an office block, it changes the psyche of those people. We were supposed to have this connection with the world around us and understand that we can play a role. I mean, one of the biggest findings with, the healthiness of gardening or farming is this, if you talk about the best smells on the planet, my favourite smell, my top 5 smells would be freshly baked bread, particularly sourdough bread, a freshly ground coffee. The kids gave me a coffee grinder, beautiful smell, that freshly ground coffee in the morning. A baby's head, so a baby has this beautiful smell that comes out of its head because it's born completely sterile and it's got no digestive organs at all. And basically it's got this smell that makes you want to cuddle it, because that's why there's such a familial link, a family link to everyone having the same organisms, because basically your family cuddles you, your mum's got you on the breast and so forth, and you're picking up these organisms all over your skin and so forth. And that's how you populate your naked digestive tract when you're born. But that smell is a beautiful smell. But my favourite smell probably is, I still love gardening despite having these quite large farms, and the feel of the sun on your shoulders, the sweat on your brow, and the smell of a healthy soil. And then the studies have started coming out showing that smell that's created by one group of organisms called actinomycetes who produce these volatile chemicals that give the soil that lovely smell. They're called a signpost creature, and if they're there, everything else is there doing a wonderful job. So really your nose knows about the health. You've got a good block and a bad block, that will smell good, that will have no smell or smell sour. So your nose knows literally in that context, but the finding is that those volatile chemicals stimulate the production of serotonin in humans. And we look at depression and we look at farmers who've got the highest, 4 times higher suicide rate than the next closest profession. And we look at those farmers, and I look at the regenerative farmers, so the nutrition farmers and biological farmers around the planet, and I know of no one who's committed suicide. And I reckon there's a link there, there's no science, but I know thousands upon thousands of farmers in the 55 countries in which we work, and I know of not a single suicide. And I'm saying there might be something to the fact that we were supposed to have healthy soils and work with healthy soils and produce the serotonin. Suicide, depression, which is 3 times higher in farmers than the next group, is about a lack of serotonin. And here you've got healthy soils stimulating your production of this wonderful feel-good substance. So I think you're supposed to create healthy soils, and you're certainly supposed to work out amongst them and get your hands dirty and get some of those probiotic organisms. One of the key organisms in the soil is called Bacillus subtilis, and we now know that maybe you leave a little bit of dirt and have a bite of your carrot with the soil on, because Bacillus subtilis is a wonderfully powerful probiotic in the human body. The Germans in the war noted that they were losing people to this dysentery. You just dehydrated, you just pooed till you died, and they couldn't solve it. They were given antibiotics and so on. Then they noted the locals would reach down and take a bit of dried camel poo and eat it. They'd do that, once a day sort of thing. So they analysed, and it was filled with this soil organism called Bacillus subtilis, and so that's called spore biotics. These things create spores, and you can take those things. They're in the soil, they're part of a healthy soil. So, yeah, it's interesting. So this is just the last thing to conclude. The importance of insects. There are 50,000, for example, different parasitic wasps. Generalists like Trichogramma lay their eggs on 200 pest moth larvae. Lacewings that are called the aphid line control much more than aphids. The larvae is the predator. It feeds upon all soft-bodied insects, including aphids, mites, scale, mealybugs, thrips, whitefly, psyllids, leafhopper, and small caterpillars. So you can see these guys having a bit of a feed here on this caterpillar. This whole predatory thing with insects is of huge importance. But the sad part about that is the German study, and this slide's not telling about it. We'll talk about this first. German researchers found that the vibration of honeybees above blossoms stopped caterpillars from feeding. They couldn't tell whether it was bees or parasitic wasps. But a 3-week lifespan, a single lacewing larva can eat 11,000 spider mites, 4,000 aphids, 250 leafhopper nets, and 6,500 scale eggs. So they're wonderful for controlling things. And spiders, you want them throughout your orchard. My orchard's just filled with insects since we bought it and stopped the use of chemicals in that orchard. But this is the sad part and the scary part. A large German study, 27 years in the making, wasn't even on farm, it was in parks and reserves with a whole bunch of master's students monitoring flying insects. And what they published 2.5 years back was a 75% reduction in over 27 years in flying insects. And now that study has been replicated in the Amazon and in 13 other locations, that there's this huge, they say the simplest test is the windscreen test. Now, I could drive from my Sunshine Coast farm up to my Stanthorpe farm 4 hours, and I do that every weekend. And 10 years even ago, you would have had splats all over the windscreen. There's one splat. That's the windscreen test. Insects are the basis of all life on the planet. We've got to bring them back. And so farmers and gardeners can do a tremendous amount in terms of recognising and looking after these creatures. So you can do these things. Snags, nesting bots, stem bundles to attract beneficials. This is a stem bundle. Basically, they'll come in there and they'll lay and they'll propagate all these beneficial insects. And those are the guidelines. I'll make these slides available so you'll have all these notes. But 2.5 to 10 mil, you can drill them with a drill into an old log or whatever, but you can set this up around your property. You don't have a tunnel, basically with a stem you make sure the holes don't go right through because they want to go in, they don't want predators to come in the back because they guard the front. But you can just really, really set up. We've got farms in England now that are putting in flowers for pollinating insects and moths and so forth right around the borders of all their farms, and it looks beautiful. I mean, it's a lovely scenario to turn your farm kind of into a park, but serving that huge importance of bringing back these insects. We need to recognise things and we need to get to work it, and every gardener can do it. So another simple native pollinator refuge is called a stem bundle. It might be a bundle of weeds or bamboo, cut sections after a natural node to create a back wall. So you cut it off after the node in here so that they can get in there, but there's a node that stops them going further. And you just strap them, tie them together and hang them in trees. And then the insects will live within that. And we can all do these sort of things. They're not difficult. The snags, the nesting box, the stem bundles, position them to the east, facing the morning sun is where you put them when you hang them in the tree. But these are simple things that we all can involved in. So a genuinely holistic approach to food production should also have a focus upon the health of the farming. And as we said, it's now been discovered that a healthy soil actually gives you that feel-good hormone. So in conclusion, your garden is your ultimate wellness tool. If you're producing food, there is no profession on the planet more important than food production. The work that Matt's doing out there at the moment is wonderful work. There's no job more important than that. And we've got a huge crisis in food production. You've got no conception of where we're heading as we speak at the moment. Like if you're in, and I don't know, I'm not buying into conspiracy theories, but the Chinese always have a game plan. I do a lot of work in China. And the Chinese basically, they have a 5-year, 10-year, 50-year, 100-year game plan with things. And they shut down all of their output. They're the largest. There's no one even slightly close to them in producing what's called DAP and MAP, the most widely used fertilisers in the world. They just said, we're not selling it anymore. I mean, they sacrificed hundreds of billions of trillions of dollars and they can't use it themselves. I mean, why would you do that? And then there was a huge shortage of urea based upon natural gas, which is quadrupled in price that makes it, so the price is going up anyway. And then a whole bunch of urea plants, the biggest plants in the world, were knocked out by cyclones in the US. And then the Chinese said, we're not selling urea either. What reason, And now there's just this food crisis developed. You're living in a sort of a third world scenario, a sort of subsistent farming, and there's 500 million people that qualify just on our doorstep. And you've got your little patch the size of this room or twice the size of it that grows your rice, and you spent you grow that rice on nothing but nitrogen. You can, it's pretty low quality food, but at least it's food and it gives you a bit of income. And your 50 kilos of urea, which is what they all use, costs you $25, which is a lot of money for you. Now that 50 kilos of urea costs you $75 and you haven't got it. So you use half of that and you grow half the amount of food. Well, there's going to be food crises. Watch this space. You won't believe what you'll see in the next 2 years. There are so many dramas. It's just like a perfect storm that's happening. So grow your own food, get that security, learn how to do it. It's the best fun ever. Once you start doing it and you learn and you know what you're doing, so you're not just gardening blind and you grow this useless stuff that attracts insects. But understanding what you're doing as Matt said the same thing. He's a food producer. He's out there telling you, go out and grow your own food. It is so important. So thank you for coming along and listening. I hope that you learned something. Any questions?
You mentioned protozoa and growing in lucerne.
Yes.
Does it grow in the foliage as well as in the roots?
No, it only happens when you've got the hay, because the hay then becomes this very high, it dries up and that concentrates it. and it becomes this very high protein concentrate with 30 to 1 carbon and nitrogen, which is high protein, and protozoa love that, so they start breeding up in the hay. So they're not just growing on the living protozoa. Once you've cut and dropped it and it turns into the equivalent of hay on the soil, then the protozoa will come in.
As it's decomposing.
Yeah, as it's decomposing, they just love that mulch.
Right.
Yeah.
So how does the earthworms get the protozoa naturally?
Well, the protozoa are always there anyway, normally, but we just knock them around with many of our farming practices. So bringing them back in large numbers brings back the earthworms in large numbers because it's their favourite food. It's literally, of all the things they can eat, that's their favourite. So they can sense it. They'll come from wherever and show up. Like I've got raised beds, and you think, well, how? I mean, I had 5 earthworms per shovelful when I did my count some time back because I'm neglecting my gardens, I'm travelling. And I did a 20-litre bucket on just these couple of beds. So it was quite a lot, but I made a 20-litre bucket of just some loose and some molasses and fish, and they bubbled it for 2 days with a little fish tank aerator and 2 little air stones that gives you lots of little bubbles. It's a dual outlet $20 fish tank aerator. And then watered that, diluted and watered it on these beds. It's actually 4 beds. And that count of 4 earthworms went up to 17 earthworms, within 3 weeks. So where did they come from? I mean, they didn't double or multiply. You can't do that in that short of time. They just come in for that food source. Yeah, it's wonderful to bring back earthworms.
So if you can't get loose in hay, is there anything else?
Well, I don't know, because you'd imagine it's the protein they're chasing. You'd imagine that pea straw or something like that, but I've not done the work to see because lucern's so readily available over there. But yeah, I mean, surely the livestock guys would bring lucerne over here. I don't know, is it available in the island or not?
I just asked, no, you've got to get the seed inoculated, but
Okay.
it can be bought in.
Oh, it can be. Okay.
The seed can, yeah.
Okay. Okay, yeah. Any other questions at all? About anything at all? Feel free.
You talk about increasing calcium. How's the best way to increase the calcium?
Well, the best way is just using some limestone. It's interesting that George Washington was referred to as the father of American agriculture because he realised that here you've got these beautiful glacial-derived soils with this wonderful mineralisation, but they're going nowhere quickly, and the missing mineral was the trucker of all minerals, calcium. But see, when you take a tonne of lime, there's 400 kilos of calcium, it's 40% calcium, but only 5 kilos of that's available. And if you compost it or whatever, you can fast track that or put humic acid with it, that'll make the availability quicker. But burnt lime, so what Washington, and why they call him the father of American, he set up lime pits across the entire American countryside and you burnt it. And when you burn lime, which is builder's lime, then you've actually 30 times more, you've got 150 kilos of immediately available calcium. So you only use it at small amounts, and often you put a little bit of sort of humic acid, carbon or molasses or something to buffer it, but that just gives you bang, that's just calcium immediately, and you get such a nice response. So that's the other way you can do it.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Dinner is ordered.
Yeah.
And almost served at the club.
Okay, I got the message. Okay, thank you.
So
Any
I'm
other
sorry.
questions? Thank you very much.